Okay, Swade, if you think we've got everybody in, we'll go ahead and start. I want to welcome everybody today. I am Dolores Best. I own Book No Further in downtown Roanoke, along with my husband, Craig Coker. And we are an independent bookstore. We have new and used. And one of the things we do especially is to focus on our local authors. And of course, Sarah Warburton is one of our most successful ones now. And so we're really excited about tonight. We'll tell you a little bit about Sarah, although I believe it looks like from the sign-on list, most of you will know this. She is a graduate of, excuse me, the little College of William and Mary, the University of Georgia, go Bulldogs, and Brown University. And she has worked in publishing for quite a while, and her work with novels, I think, is, from what I've talked with Sarah, is sort of the road she's been aiming for a while. And the stories she's told me, and I'm sure she'll share some, she's really seeing how working and having a goal in mind, how you can get where you want to go. And we look forward to hearing more about that. And Sarah, you can go ahead and start.
Thank you, Dolores, and Swade working tech for us at Book No Further. And thank you guys for coming and supporting me and supporting a local bookstore. It's been a long road. Dolores and I were talking, this is not necessarily where we thought we would be doing a second virtual event, but it is really lovely that everybody could come together from all over. And that has just been really special. The first book, Once Two Sisters, came out right there in the smack dab in the middle of the pandemic in September of 2020. And I was so grateful that it connected with people. People wanted to read it. It was a Pop Sugar pick. It was a Crime Reads pick. It got a starred review from Publishers Weekly. Because I had a 2-book contract, I knew I would need to start thinking about the next book. And actually, I've been pretty fortunate. When I think I told many of you, I started writing, I was writing sort of a town and gown mystery. I was in grad school. I went on to have kids and write for a monthly magazine. And that first book got picked up by an agent and then did not get picked up by a publisher. But I had it in mind it was going to be a trilogy. So the next book I wrote was the second book in that series. And it was a little darker and a little more, well, it was about political corruption. So it was less town and gown mystery and more straight up crime. But that agent sort of rethought what she wanted to do with her life. And I found myself with 2 books and no agent. And I thought, let me do something completely different. The first short story I ever had published featured one of my favorite topics, sisters. I have 3 younger sisters. We are fortunately very close, nothing like the sisters in this book, but I just love thinking about the way that we define ourselves and frame who we are through the lens of who we think our sisters are or who they think we are. So I thought, let's do something totally different. Let's do a first person, unreliable narrator from the point of view of the younger sister, which is a perspective that I have never enjoyed because I am the oldest. So it was really fun to immerse myself in that point of view right off the bat. About the time that I was nearing the end of that book, I was flying down to Texas to go to the DFW Writers Conference, which I had gone to a number of years with a friend of mine who's on the chat, Angelique. And I was listening to true crime podcasts because that's what I do when I walk the dog for 30 to 45 minutes in the morning, when I'm on an airplane. I really like Criminal, narrated by Phoebe Judge. In this case, I wanted something really long, and Case File is one I really like. They do a lot of research, and there's not a lot of filter, I would say. So you get, it's more about just the facts, but it's really meticulously researched. And they had a 3-part series on the Moores murderers. And I was like, well, that ought to get me just about from Charlotte, North Carolina, down to Dallas. And I put it in, and I was sort of familiar with the case. It's from the 1960s. Ian Brady and Myra Hindley together killed four young men, four kids in Manchester, England, between 1963 and 1965. And I won't go particularly into those details. They really don't have much bearing on the book. The part of the story I was not familiar with was the way that they were caught. It turns out that Myra's brother-in-law lived next door, and they were godparents to that next door neighbor's couple's child, and they hung out together all the time. And one night, this neighbor, Smith, came over, decided to borrow a cup of sugar or something, and he happened to walk into a crime scene. It was one of the few murders that they committed in their home. And it was essentially like, oh, look, here's Bob. Bob, hold this axe for a minute. He was there for about 5 hours during the crime scene, afraid for his life, gets back home, tells his wife, get away, wake up, get away from the window, get the baby. And they drive to the police station. And that is how the Moores murderers were caught. They had been doing this for 2 years, and it took neighbors to turn them in. And then, of course, the British press being what it is, immediately the questions came up. How much did the neighbors know? How could they not have been involved? How could they? Well, I will admit freely, I stopped researching there because I knew what part I was interested in. I was interested in that next door neighbor's house. I was interested in what was happening in that marriage. I was interested in what happened with them afterwards. How do you go on with your life after that kind of trauma? So I, finished writing Once Two Sisters. There was a large revision process for it. But the whole time I kept kind of thinking. It was like a little piece of sand in an oyster. It's the burr. I kept thinking about it. And so when I went to write You Can Never Tell, it was a very different experience. Once Two Sisters has two narrators, our oldest sister and the youngest sister. And I started that book writing it at the beginning. And that first opening line where Zoe is complaining about her older sister is very close to the first draft that I wrote. With all the revisions that it went through, that first page is pretty similar. With You Can Never Tell, the first scene that I wrote actually takes place in the middle of the book. And it's that terrifying night. And I believe that they spoil it on the back of the book, that particular moment. So I'm not spoiling anything here. But because that was the structure, the big terrifying moment is in the middle. And for the first half of the book, our narrator, Casey, does not know that she has met a serial killer. There were some challenges to putting the book together. And that is when I turned again back to my love for podcasts. Something else I have spoken about in Once Two Sisters, there is a podcaster who shows up. Zoe is sitting in a hotel lobby with her stepdaughter, trying to convince herself everything is going to be okay. Her missing big sister is going to turn up because she clearly did this herself. And then this podcaster pops up. And in the first draft of my book, that podcaster never left. She loans Zoe a phone. She drives her all over the place. She is in every single scene towards the end of the book. And she is not in the copy of the book that you hopefully have now because she had no reason to be there. She had no emotional stakes. I think it was my love for podcasts that put her in there. I may have overcorrected a little bit here, and we actually have a fictional podcast that I created, Crime to Chat with Helen and Julia, and there are transcripts of it throughout You Can Never Tell. And Casey is listening to somebody else tell the story that she has lived. So we know that she's in a true crime story. We know that she is in something that will be the subject of a podcast before she knows it. And I was hoping to get sort of that feeling of impending doom. That was sort of where I was going with that. And actually, I love reading the book. I will say the audio narration is a lot of fun too. Georgina Marie, who is the narrator, does all the voices really well. So that was super fun. the other theme of this book, I would say if Once Two Sisters is about sisters, You Can Never Tell is about female friendship. Casey, our main character, our narrator, when we meet her, has been badly burned by her former best friend. She's been set up for embezzling. Her professional reputation is ruined, and she has fled to Texas, much as Zoe did here, to live with her husband and kind of settle down. And she's like, well, now I don't know what I'm going to do with my life. And she doesn't know if she can trust anyone again. And I think friendship is one of those things where, I mean, technically, there's no law that says that you have to have friends. You're not born with them. You can lose them. But I also think that they're one of those things that is essential to living a good life. And so Casey is sort of navigating through this new world, trying to figure out who she can trust, who's going to be a friend, who's the kind of friend you can keep. And of course, because, I think this is actually some people, well, all of them have some sort of secret. And of course, one of the secrets is the kind of secret you don't come back from, the serial killer kind. And for that, I got to do some really fun research. I did read Text Me When You Get Home, which is by Kayleen Schaefer. We read that for one of my book clubs. And then one by one of my favorite nonfiction authors, Deborah Tannen, called You're the Only One I Can Tell, which is kind of explores, how we navigate female friendships, how maybe they differ from other kinds of relationships. I have been very fortunate in that I don't know what is because I had sisters and what is just because I have been lucky in life, but in having made numbers of good female friends throughout my life. And in You Can Never Tell, Casey does she does join a neighborhood association. And I know at least one of the attendees is someone that I met through the New Territory Women's Association, and others of you are people I met through the Blacksburg Newcomers Club. And you'll be happy to hear that there is a disclaimer in the back of the book that says none of these organizations are anything like the Bluebonnets, except in one respect. Much like Casey, I met some of my closest friends by taking the first step and walking into a room full of strangers. So I think that I did draw, as I drew on family relationships here, I did draw on some friendship relationships here, but it's always dialing those fears and anxieties. Can I like this person? Will this person like me? Am I going to sound stupid? What are they really thinking? And dialing it up to 11. So that was my goal with this book. When I thought about what I might read tonight, and I won't read too long, I think that gets a little tedious, but I have just the opening. The opening is different from the rest of the book. Most of the book is first person. Casey is just experiencing her life and we go through with her. But in the opening, we have a letter to her daughter, Grace. And then I'll read the first of the podcast transcripts as well. Dear Grace, you're not even 2 years old, way too young for the lessons I have to share. You're still learning to say simple words like daddy and dog. I describe everything we do as we do it, like the narrator to a film we're living. Modeling, it's called, by speech therapists and child development experts in parenting books. It's the way I put words together as I demonstrate the action, phrasing a question, then providing the answer. Shall we make lunch? Let's see what's in the fridge. Do you want juice? After lunch, it's time for a nap, and so on. And all the while, you putter around your play kitchen, dropping wooden blocks into a small pot and feeding your baby doll or offering a block to the bewildered dog. At the end of each day, between your bath and bedtime, your daddy reads you a book with stiff cardboard pages. Tonight, he chose a simplified version of Cinderella. You patted the pumpkin and laughed when he waved his finger like a wand and booped you on the nose. You don't know you have a godmother, not a fairy one who could transform vermin and vegetables into a coach and four. The woman we asked to be your godmother was something different. She was the Baba Yaga of legend, the Countess of Bathory, the stuff of nightmares. And for a while, I called her my friend. Maybe comparing her to larger-than-life figures makes her sound intriguing, even appealing, but that was her power. She mimicked emotion, she created the illusion of relationship, and she blinded with her charisma. Charisma isn't the same thing as character. I know that now. She's the reason your father still wakes up screaming. If the world could be pressed into a cardboard book, the evil witch could be identified by her long nails and her smirk, but your godmother wasn't a witch. She was a predator, a wolf in sheep's clothing, the spider inviting a fly into her parlor, and I fell into her web. Looking at you now, your eyes drooping, your little body curled around your stuffed rabbit, I can't imagine the time you'll be old enough to hear the truth. Maybe this story will make you safer and keep you wiser. But I'm afraid that words aren't strong enough for this lesson. People's words can't be trusted. Not everyone is who they pretend to be. Your father shouldn't be reading you Cinderella. He should be reading Red Riding Hood. That's the reason I listen to true crime podcasts while you nap and your father is at work. I'm part of a sisterhood, scarred in a way no one can see, but I'm not alone. I used to think we told stories as a way to hold back the dark, but now I think stories are a training ground, an opportunity to do a dry run through danger. If Hansel and Gretel had read their fairy tales, they might have recognized the witch before they ended up in a cage. Here's the truth, Grace. You have two sets of loving grandparents, two amazing aunts, a mother and father who adore you, and a godmother who's a serial killer. That's the story I don't want you to hear. Not now. Maybe not ever. But the world won't keep it a secret. On my phone, I have the newest episode of my favorite true crime podcast queued up waiting, and I can feel the pressure building. This is the first time I'll hear my story told by someone else. These hosts, Helen and Julia, they sound like friends. But now I wonder what they'll think of my choices, what version they'll share. How do you know you're living a true crime story? Maybe the better question is, how do you know you'll survive one? And the first transcript of the Crime to Chat, Helen says, this is a story about friends. Julia, friends like us. Helen, not exactly like us. Hey, I always said I'd kill for you. And you were the one I'd call to help bury the bodies. But if I did the killing, wouldn't I be calling you? That kind of thinking is exactly why we won't get caught. Anyway, on this episode of Crime to Chat, we'll introduce you to an idyllic neighborhood, a storybook life, two friends, and the twisted, bloody secrets underneath it all. But first, let me tell you about some of our amazing sponsors who make this podcast possible. I wrote a piece for Crime Reads that will be coming out soon about books based on true crime cases. And in thinking about true crime podcasts and in reading these novels based on true crime cases, I was doing a lot of thinking, and I have read articles about why we are so fascinated with true crime. What is it that draws us to it? And I think the only answer I can come up with is kind of the same reason that I like to write fiction. For me, the questions I'm looking to answer or the things I'm looking to explore are what kind of world we live in and how do we live in it. So when I thought about that moment in Manchester, in that house where a man has come in and said, you know, our best friends, the ones that we thought we could trust, the ones that were godparents to our child, they're not who we thought they were. That was my question, is how do you keep going forward after that? What is the next step? but I wanted to sort of give Casey a double dose of that. So when she first gets to Texas in the very first chapter, right after that podcast, she's already asking herself, how do I make friends after the person who was my best friend betrayed me? What do I do now? How can I tell people that I am known as an embezzler, even though it's not true? Why would people believe me? And hopefully by the end of the book, we see that Casey is stronger than she thought and has, I think, the resilience to reach out and to move forward. So that was my goal. I was describing my books to someone as kind of creepy thrillers, but I'm going for the feel-good, happy ending. If that makes sense. So I want us to care for these characters, and I want us to want them to learn and grow from the horrible things that happen during the course of the book. So that was my goal and my plan. And I don't know if you have questions yet, but
I will offer this. If you guys have a question, you can put it in the chat box there and we'll ask Sarah, or if you want to raise your hand, you can unmute and ask your questions. This is really informal. I will start first with a statement and then ask a question or two. I was really disappointed that you didn't have the bad guy kill off the really rotten friend. I thought, oh, that would be perfect, but maybe that's too much to wish for. I haven't been through one like that in life one time. Yeah, I guess it's a little too much to wish for, but
I won't lie, I thought about it, but I did. And again, it's funny because it is the novel's fictional, and it's everything is amped up, but I guess I actually don't believe that everybody gets what's coming to them. And so I think that may be where that came from. I think we need to be satisfied with the ending of the novel, but yeah, that I think that we all can think of that person that we would like to get what's coming to them, but it just might not happen.
Yeah.
It's another thing we have to live through.
I have just one question about your process. You said you had a 2-book contract. Did you have ideas for both books, or were you finishing Once Two Sisters and having to come up with an idea for the next one?
When I had the contract for Once Two Sisters, I had heard the podcast, so I had that kind of vague, but I hadn't started writing anything yet. So I didn't know. I hadn't thought about Casey. I hadn't thought about the friend betrayal. I had thought about just that one moment. So that's all I had at that point. Right now, what I'm working on is proposals in order to get a new contract. But when I was about halfway through this one, I got obsessed with the 60s, the weather underground, and the idea of DNA testing. So I have something kind of worked up on that's being looked at. And as I was working that up, and that's not fully written, it's just a proposal, then I had a thought for something structured a little more like this, that I was calling the camp story for a long time. It's a woman who believes her sister-in-law killed her brother, and she's going to camp to try to get in with her niece who doesn't know her. So it's so we'll see if anything comes of either of those. It's always hard to tell, but yeah, so right now, and then actually in other, hopefully someday will be good news, my agent did read that first Town and Gown mystery, liked it, had many great suggestions. I have started revising it, and hopefully at some point that will be something that will find a home.
Well, we do have a couple questions in the chat. We've got one from Patricia Bruder. She says, did you model the art museum on a real life museum?
I would say...
is it the Taubman?
I would say yes and no. So I would say I knew kind of what I wanted it to look like. Like I had a very clear idea of that glass front and the steps coming up. And I honestly, I wonder if that kind of wing off the side isn't the way the Transportation Museum would look if it were sort of melded onto the side of the Taubman. There is an art museum in Montclair. But other than the fact that it exists and appears to be lovely online, I don't know anything about it particularly, and it's not located where my museum is located. I mean, they're both in Montclair, but the Montclair Art Museum is kind of off in its own area, and I put mine right on like the main street. So yeah, I would say much like my characters, it's inspired by a couple of different things, and then I kind of put it together to suit my purposes.
And did you have some?
Did a really good job of describing it that I could visualize it.
Oh, I'm so glad. You know, you never know, but that's exactly. And you know, I love the Taubman, and so that is a great museum to go to. I would say it's not my museum, but it's parts of it are maybe a little bit like the opening, and maybe with the glass, and so.
And for those you might not know, the Taubman is the art museum of Western Virginia, and it is a very unique kind of architecture for downtown Roanoke. Downtown Roanoke sprung up in the late 19th century, and this one is not late 19th century architecture. You'll just have to Google Art Museum in Roanoke, and you will find it. We also have a question from Rodney Walther. Your new book has a woman moving to a new city and trying to make friends. How did your family's transplant from Texas to Virginia help you tap into those emotions? You mentioned the Blacksburg Newcomers Club. Mm-hmm. What else did you use in your experience in the book?
Well, and honestly, it's sort of, because I have done that more than once, but I would say when I moved to Texas, in 2004, I was already thinking how to meet people, because when I had moved to New Mexico, I think for 3 years, I knew the people at the bookstore where I worked and the people in my classes, but I didn't really. So when I moved to Texas the first time, I joined the New Territory Women's Association, which had a play group and book clubs and a movie night. And I joined a writers group, and eventually through the writers group and some other things, actually ended up meeting Rodney. But when I moved here, I already had kind of that game plan in mind. So I did join the Blacksburg Newcomers Association, and actually jazzercise. And Tim, actually, my husband, says that when I wave to someone, he always says, newcomers or jazzercise. I'm like, now Lisa's both, but I did find that, and for me, joining that organization is the first thing, the scary thing, because it's the big group meetings you go to and everybody seems like they already know each other. I definitely felt that all over again here when we first moved here. I went to the big holiday brunch and I knew 2 people in a room full of like 80 people. And Tim had come with me because they said it was co-ed and he didn't see any other guys. So he dropped me off and left.
That's good support.
Pretty much. But, then 3 years, 2 or 3 years later, I was president of it. So there you go. So.
Okay, if possible, discuss without spoilers, what surprised you the most when you were putting the story together, how it unfolded and evolved? Did it go places you didn't expect?
It did. I mean, I knew that characters beside my serial killer were going to have secrets. And I knew Casey had her big secret that she didn't want to tell people about her past. I did not know necessarily what other characters' secrets were. And there were some moments where I would be writing a scene and I'm like, okay, and then it would just come out. I'm like, oh, well, that makes sense. I was doing a lot of sort of rough draft exploration. And so I would start writing and I would say, okay, Casey's gone over and I'm in Casey's point of view. So I actually don't know what the secret is. And then it would come out. So that was actually, it was a lot of fun. And then I actually did not know I would spend quite as much time in New Jersey as I ended up spending. And it was good. It was a happy surprise. It was.
Well, how do you handle your first one? You really only had two voices to look at, and this one you had several. What do you do to keep them distinct? How do you put your in that mind frame?
Well, with Once Two Sisters, when I was going back over it with my editor's notes, I actually spent quite a lot of time differentiating the two because it was tricky because they were both two women, similar age. I mean, just like 3 years difference, similar background, same family. I think sisters often, have similar styles of speaking. So I really had to work hard to differentiate them. With this one, my primary voice was Casey, so that was great. I could just be Casey. And then it was Millie, the podcasts, and that kind of developed. So I think when I first started, maybe the two voices weren't as clear or as defined. And I would say that I definitely owe a lot to writers groups who would read it and say, it sounds like Julia's the quippier one. And so then I would go back and sort of revise with an eye to that. And I do think that there is a tendency in podcasts, I'm thinking of My Favorite Murder or True Crime Garage, or even something that's not crime related, like Even the Rich, for in a story for one of the two to take sort of the factual narrative lead of the story and the other one to provide more of the commentary. And while I was inspired by, say, Case File, which is a single narrator podcast, because of this theme of friendship, I thought it was really important to have two women and have that friendship bonding, playing off each other going on.
One thing that I get asked a lot in our store, we get a lot of local authors that have really good books they're working on, and they really want to go the traditional route, and they're interested in finding an agent. I believe you and I had a conversation early on about how you went about finding an agent, and I just wonder if you could recap that and just offer any advice or just some comments on what the experience was like.
Absolutely. And actually, there are several ways to successfully find an agent. I happened to find both of the agents that I have had at conferences. The first one was at a Houston Writers Conference, and only 3 agents were going to be in attendance. And my understanding was that you had like 60 seconds to say to the agent, I have written a novel, it's a thriller, this is what it's about. And if they liked it or if they represented it, they would give you their card and then you could submit to them. So that had been my only goal, was to get 3 cards. Then, in the in-between time looking for an agent, I did a lot of time at the Dallas-Fort Worth Writers Conference, which is a fantastic one in that they usually get a wide range of industry professionals, and they're very accessible. So you can have one-on-one meetings, but they also appear at cocktail hours. So then it's just a matter of getting your nerve up. And in that instance, I would say it really helped also to be friends with writers. I had not found it to be a highly competitive, cutthroat experience. In fact, I have a buddy down there who would play, tag teams. So we would go in and he would say, that book that you're talking about sounds great, but my friend's book is actually kind of similar. And then I would pitch my book, and then I would say, hey, but your book is. And so then it's kind of easier sometimes to pitch someone else's book. But then I have a friend in Italy, Stacy Esklin, who has signed with, I don't even know how many agents. She signed with 2. She's had 2 agents in the last 5 years, both of whom she just cold queried, which is when you have researched through, I think Writer's Digest does a list of literary agents. You can also find them online, and they'll tell you what they're representing, they're looking for. And now I say that there's also Twitter is great. They do Pitch Mad, where you can pitch to agents on Twitter. There's something called Manuscript Wish List, where new agents will say, you know what I really want to read? I want to read Scooby-Doo, but with vampires. And that's your book. Now you know which agent to send it to you. But it's always a question, if you haven't met the agent in person and had the agent say, send it to me, go on the website for the agency, look at what they say they want, follow the directions, and email them. And I think it's a mistaken belief that this cold query, this sending an email, doesn't net you anything. Stacy's living proof that that's not in fact the case, that she's gotten both her agents that way. And I was, also doing that while going to conferences. The crime book before this, the sequel, I think I submitted that to about 83 agents. But I know, I think there are many problems with that book, but there was some interest, but it wasn't like this one where I submitted it to 10 agents and I was having requests for the full manuscript. You can tell from the kind of feedback you're getting if your manuscript and your submission is really where it needs to be. And, I know that traditional publishing, people say, oh, you need the agent and you go to the big house. I also have friends who've had a lot of luck with smaller they're traditionally published. It's not a hybrid. They're not paying anything, but a smaller publishing house that maybe specializes in what you do. Something like Bold Stroke Books, if you're an LGBTQ plus author, or I think White Wolf maybe does fantasy.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, we found that we have some favorites that we always watch their sales and stuff because, well, in an independent store, you're going to get the big names and hear about the big names, but we want the ones that are really going to help discover a writer.
Yeah.
I was part of a industry event back in June where some publishers and editors from publishers were talking about what they're working on, upcoming books, and the question of what are you looking for came up. And I will tell you, sadly, and I hope I don't disappoint anybody, that World War II fiction has just about been done. So unless you have something really new, the poor woman in London waiting for her man and being bombed while she's saving the world is probably not the thing you're going to be able to sell. But it sounded like a lot of other things were. So that's really good. We've got another question from Chuck Brownman. He wants to know if you expect to see your podcasters coming back narrating another story.
I am playing around with that idea. I have got 2 sample podcasts in this camp story, but honestly, the final decision on that would be how people like it in this book. And if people don't like it, it might not show up in another book. And from the early reviews, I think people love it or not so much. And I think that may be the way it is with podcasts too. I think people really like them or they just don't listen to them. But hopefully, I'm hoping people will like Helen and Julia. And I found them fun.
Did you consider, I read another one just recently that was a podcast, but the whole book was the podcast. And it had people that were, the players in the story, say the women in the Bluebells or something, were telling their version of what happened later. Did you consider structuring it as just a podcast?
I did think about that. I just really liked going deep into Casey's point of view and her character. She is not somebody who has told or I think will tell her story. And so I thought it was sort of fun to have the difference between the person who lived the story and the people who are looking at it from the outside. I know that Sadie is another really great, I think it's a YA one where there is a podcaster and it gets involved in the case. And yet for me, I really wanted these podcasters to be sort of in your ear and not flesh and blood, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay, let's see. Do we have any other questions anybody has, or we can open it up if you want to raise your hand. I know that one of the things that a lot of authors tell me that when they come visiting in the store or that we discovered is that although Sarah is with a national publishing company, it's not where they go out and just put you on this great big tour and while you're wined and dined. Can you talk a little bit about what it's like to market your own book once it's out and sell your book? I mean, you've already sold it to the agent and then to the publisher. What's it like then to sell it to the public?
It is a different skill set for sure. And it's, as you know, I worked as a bookseller for a number of years at Books on the Square in Providence and at Page One in Albuquerque. And actually worked in marketing for 10 years, writing advertorials for UpClose magazine in Texas. But it feels very different to be selling your own book, largely because it feels so personal. And I think it's the same reason that we authors have a hard time distilling the book down into, say, the one page that the agent wanted to see in the first place, because we're like, it's all important. All 300 pages of it are just crucial. It was really interesting to be doing that author speed dating, which was pitching my book to readers. And so that was Once Two Sisters. For this one, I was trying to think, how would I, so I've been calling it my suburban serial killer novel. I have played around with Canva a lot. I did some things with succulents because to me that reads very suburban right now. Kind of how well do you know your neighbors? It's true. And, you know, I feel sometimes you feel like all I'm saying online is my book, my book, my book, my book. And then, you know, somebody will say to me, you have a book out? I didn't even know you had a first book. So, you know, but if you do follow me, you know, and it's hard to say, I don't get the sales sheets fast enough to know what's having an effect. I don't want to alienate people, but I have my newsletter. I try to generally offer other value in there. So I almost always have a link to a recipe, the books my book clubs are reading. You know, if there are things like that that you like, what I'm knitting, if you like that kind of thing, my newsletter tries to keep it kind of tight, but with links. And then I'm really active on Instagram. I know they say that social media doesn't sell books, but Instagram is where I do, you know, again, what I'm reading, what my dog Daisy is doing, where we've walked, what I'm knitting, and little bits about writing. You know, I'll tell people what I'm researching or where I'm writing, and I have found that to be a very encouraging community. There's this whole Bookstagram thing where people will review books and post pretty pictures, and I do enjoy that. But as far as how to market, what to market, that's something I'm still kind of feeling out. I'm mostly just trying to be, I know this sounds, trying to be authentic, trying to put myself out on Instagram, say who I am, what I'm doing, and not beat people over the head too much.
Well, you're definitely in a niche that's pretty hot right now. We refer to it in the store sometimes as domestic fiction or domestic thrillers. And I don't know if it's just people being stuck inside with their family, that all this imagination's running loose about what can happen in domestic situations. But do you have any comments on what's coming next or what you want to work on? You've touched it a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, it will depend honestly on what somebody is interested in publishing. But yeah, the first idea is a woman whose teenage daughter, gets one of those DNA ancestry tests from her uncle and takes the test, and it pulls a match to an FBI cold case, a bank robbery from the 60s, and the DNA test is to the woman everybody thought was dead, her grandmother. So it is a mother, daughter, granddaughter story. And that one I would really love to write fully and hopefully. And then the other one, the camp story, is this man, Aiden, is gone on a camping trip, and all that is found is the bloody slashed remains of his tent. And his wife has an alibi. It's not a great one, but she has one. Well, her sister-in-law is sure that she did it. Her in-laws took her to court, civil court, and they lost. And she's now just waiting for her $1 million payout. She's going to take her daughter and leave the country. But her sister-in-law is going into camp to pose as a counselor and try to get information from the niece, or maybe try to take off with the niece. It's not real clear at the beginning of the book. So that one would have 2 points of view. And that's the one I was playing around with, the idea of the podcast as a way to tell the murder, which happens before the book starts. So.
Okay. Well, I don't see any more questions here. I want to thank Sarah and thank everybody who's tuned in today. We'll hopefully, when you get this next one done, and we're going to have a in the store party that time, we hope. We'll be sure and invite all you folks from Texas and elsewhere to join us. We do have another event coming up next week, next Tuesday. We have author Willa Reese is releasing her book, Wildwood Whispers. And that's more of a traditional Appalachian book with a little bit of magical fiction in it. So please see our calendar on our website if you're interested. And thank you again, Sarah, for joining us. And thanks, everyone. I've put a link in the chat if you'd like to purchase a book and have not yet. We'll be glad to get one right out to you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you guys for coming, and thank you, Dolores and Suede. And if you all do order a book, I have already signed them for you.
Thanks, everybody.